All right, in this lesson we're going to take a look at solving rational equations. And so an equation is something where you're solving for the variable. And we've seen just regular kinds of equations where you have to solve for this missing variable, and we have steps that we do, like subtract 1 on both sides and divide both sides by 2, and we have ways of checking and making sure that 2 times 2 plus 1 equals 5 in this case. And so that's what we're going to do, but we're going to do that with rational equations. And so rational equations are going to involve fractions and things like that as well. So what we want to do when we are solving a rational equation is think back to some things that we may have learned earlier in other courses when we were solving without too much algebra in them. And one of the easiest things to do when we were solving these sorts of equations is, instead of working with decimals or working with adding and subtracting all these fractions, is to use the idea that if you multiply one side of an equation by something and you multiply the other side of the equation by that same value, that you don't change the equation. In fact, you make it much easier to find the answer for your equation. So you change it to a form that it still produces the same value for the unknown variable, but produces a much easier question. And so in past grades you may have seen something like this, and you analyze these and you say, oh, the lowest common denominator is 6. We use that by multiplying each side, in fact each term, by 6. And I'll show that just with brackets. And 6 can divide by 3 and make 2, so you get 2x. And 6 can divide by 2 and make 3, so you get 21. And 6 can divide by 6, and so you just get 1, subtracting 20 from both sides, and you turn this question into a much easier question to do. And that's exactly what we're going to do with our rational equations. In fact, this is a type of rational equation. Now we're just going to add a little more algebra to it. So the steps that I just went through here were multiply each side by the lowest common denominator. In this case that was 6, and that cleared out the fractions. And what I mean by cleared out fractions is, in this step there's no fractions. And although we love fractions, it's nice with algebra not to have to worry about them. So then we solved the algebra, and that takes a few steps to do. With rational equations, sometimes there will be restrictions. So we didn't see any in this case, but we need to look for restrictions and then state our final solutions. So in the example that I did here, the final solution stated is x is equal to negative 10. However, when I work on a bit more complicated question, and here's the next one, x squared minus 4x minus 5. When I work on something like this, perhaps I get solutions that are things like 5. And if 5 was one of my solutions, 5 is also a restriction, and I know that it won't be a solution if it's a restriction, because it's not allowed to be that particular number, or else you would get a division by 0 error in your question. So let's take a look at doing this one. We're going to keep those steps on the page at the same time and see if we can figure out how to clear out these fractions, solve the algebra, look for restrictions, and state a final solution. Notice the big difference from things that we've been doing in this unit is that we now have this equals sign. That's a good clue that you are solving for what x value makes the left-hand side the same value as the right-hand side. So let's start. I want to multiply each side by the lowest common denominator. So I can see some of the factors, but I can't really see all the factors until I actually factor. So we will still continue to use the idea of factoring. Two numbers that multiply to negative 5 that add to negative 4 are negative 5 and 1. And I can now see that my lowest common denominator is x minus 5 times x plus 1. So there's x minus 5, x plus 1. That's the most complicated one. And these ones already contain those factors. So let's just think about that as our denominator. Now I want to multiply each side, in fact each term by that. So this one's going to get multiplied by x minus 5 and x plus 1. This one's going to get multiplied by x minus 5 and x plus 1. And this one's going to get multiplied by x plus 5 and x plus 1. So this first term, it is divided by x minus 5 and multiplied by x minus 5, so those cancel, and that results in x times x plus 1. The next term has an x plus 1 and an x plus 1 that cancel each other out, so that results in negative 3, or minus 3, and x minus 5. And the last one has lots that cancels out. The x, that should have been a minus, x minus 5, and the x plus 1. And so all that's left on the right-hand side is the number 30. And now I try and solve this. So this becomes x squared plus x minus 3x plus 15 equals 30. And that becomes x squared minus 2x, subtract 30, that makes negative 15, and equals to 0. So when you're doing these, you will sometimes end up with a quadratic, which is a degree 2 equation, and to solve those quadratics, you make it equal to 0. We'll be doing this more in another unit as well, but we make it equal to 0, and we use the same idea as we did when we were trying to look for when our denominator is equal to 0, when they're quadratics, and we see that much easier by factoring. So factor, and that will give us x minus 5 and x plus 3, and so this could equal 0 if x is 5 or if x is negative 3. So I get one solution from this part, and I get one solution from this part. And there's my solutions. But that's just solving the algebra. So I've done the first two steps. I need to think about any restrictions. And the restrictions to this one, let's do them in red right here, what x cannot be. Well, it can't be 5, and it can't be negative 1. And 5 and negative 1 have already been listed on the right hand side there. So if x can't be 5 and x is 5, well, it can't be. So combining this together, x isn't allowed to be 5. The only thing that x can be that will work out, so one side is equal to the other, is x is equal to negative 3. Okay, we'll get lots of practice in class. It's really getting to do these 4 steps. Multiply everything by the LCD, solve the algebra. There's a little tricky step down the end with the algebra, but it basically means factor and then see which piece is equal to 0, and then check it against the restrictions to get to a final answer.